As we mentioned on the previous module, this one is about breathing. So first off, big part of breathing, counter lungs.
So let me show you I'm only going to turn it one way so you can see them. Can you see this, Gus, on the screen?
Yeah.
You see that? Counter lung. What does it mean? Counter lung. I call it the storage container for your air. You exhale into your rebreather. We already talked about how it flows in, it goes in and gets cleaned by your sore, but then it has to store the air somewhere that you just exhaled, and it stores it in the counter lungs. So the volume of air has not changed. You took it out of your lungs and you stored it in the rebreather's counter lungs. So the overall volume hasn't changed. Yep. Now you breathe back in. You brought it back into your lungs and out of the rebreather's counter lungs. Volume of air hasn't changed. Therefore, breathing in and out does not affect your buoyancy unless you changed the volume of air in the rebreather.
However, even though breathing in and out doesn't affect your buoyancy, the position of the counter lungs and the position of your body does affect the easy and difficult effort to breathe, right? And I think this is where the Go shines a lot, is because the counter lungs in the Go are placed right next to your actual lungs.
Yeah, let me lean forward. Look at it. Just look at it. Look, it's going to be about right here. I guess, right? It's going to be about right here. My lungs are right here, right next to my lungs. Look how close everything is in the Go. There's not a far distance for the air to be moving in the Go. It's right next to my own lungs. Worker breathing's amazing. The hydrostatic effect is minimal. The effect of the pressure of the water changing the resistance of the breathing is one of, if not the best rated of any rebreather. Mike designed it to put these counter lungs in a position right here where it makes it so easy to breathe. Now, we both dove numerous other rebreathers. Have you ever, in any position on the Go, felt an easier work of breathing?
No.
I haven't.
And so again, if you're watching this, you already bought the class. We're not trying to sell you.
But I love that.
But the thing is that depending on the design, and this is something that people don't think about, depending on the design of the rebreather, your difficulty, your effort to breathe changes dramatically.
Yes.
And a lot of people just focus on, well, how long can I dive on that versus that? It's also how easy it is to breathe. Some of the rebreathers out there that are, for example, chest mounted, have a chest counter lung. They're not around your counter lungs, they're just on your chest. And if you're in that perfect diver position, so if you look like this, right, then your counter lungs are lower than your actual lungs, which means air wants to go up like bubbles. When you breathe in, you breathe so good. But then you're breathing out, now you're pushing air down into your counter lungs. So it's hard to exhale. By the same token, if you have a rebreather that has the counter lungs in the back, they're higher than your actual lungs. So breathing out is easy. Then you're going to breathe in. Now you're basically pulling bubbles from up into your lungs. It's hard to breathe in, right? All of this stuff matters when it comes to designing a rebreather. Some rebreathers, we talked about this very early in the class, have shoulder mounted. They are like up here around like a necklace. Shoulder mounted counter lung. Let's just say that inhaling and exhaling has the same effort, but if you're vertical and those counter lungs are higher than you, like as you're going up, or if you're going through a cave restriction or whatever, you're
hydrostatic effect. It will be higher. So look, these being right next to your lungs makes the overall inhale and exhale among the best ever tested.
Absolutely. So let's talk about respiratory physiology, right? The fact that we know that there is 21% oxygen in the air we breathe right at sea level. And we talked about that you metabolize between 4 and 5%. You know, if you're at rest, obviously you will need more if you're exerting yourself, right? But the point is that the urge to breathe is triggered by the production of CO2 or production in your blood of CO2. And from what I've seen out there, the production of CO2 starts as soon as you stop breathing. So you're breathing in and your clock starts to make you want to breathe again. And every time you inhale, that kind of clock resets and it starts going again, going and going and going. So the respiratory rate is determined by the rate of CO2 production, right? It's not so much that you need more oxygen, it's that CO2 that is affecting you.
That's right. And that's why it's so important to make sure that that sorb is working properly so you don't increase that CO2 and increase your respiratory rate, which will affect basically the volume of gas that you would use in 1 minute. I mean, if you're breathing faster, right, you're going to use more gas in a particular minute. So
there is this term, and we've talked about SAC rate before, surface air consumption rate. But there's this term called RMV, and you will see this term in multiple places. It stands for respiratory minute volume. And what RMV stands for is, or what it means is the total gas ventilated in 1 minute, right? How much you're breathing. RMV changes based on where you are, right? What is your respiratory rate, and what's the volume of gas ventilated on each breath? How much you're breathing in and out. That's what the RMB is.
And we have to calculate that on open circuit. So you're going to do a skill where you're going to swim around at a particular depth and you're going to calculate how much gas did you use. Most people use 10 minutes because the math is easy at that particular depth. And then you can ultimately take that number and convert it into a surface air consumption rate. Because why is that important? If you have to bail out of your rebreather, your surface air consumption rate may be different than mine. I need to plan that I can get to the surface based on my surface air consumption rate, right? Because I got to know based on my breathing rate,
right?
Will I have enough gas to get me out of that emergency at any point in the dive to the surface? And
that's why it's important. That's why RMV is important.
That's why we have to calculate that RMV. And most people will take you down to, I'm just telling you, probably to around 20 feet. It's a good place to practice your neutral trim and buoyancy in open circuit. They're going to look at your starting pressure and your ending pressure in your tank and how much gas did you use in that 10 minutes, how much PSI did you use to calculate your RMV, which can then later be calculated into a SAC rate, surface air consumption rate.
Yep,
very
absolutely.
Important.
So even though your open circuit, as Woody mentioned, the duration of that tank, how long is my tank going to last me if I have to bail out? Open circuit duration is determined by RMB. How long you're going to be diving because you're not breathing out on a rebreather is determined by the O2 you metabolize. How much O2 do you need for that dive? And obviously we already talked about the fact that clearing your mask and things like that will affect it. Dumping gas will affect, how long your O2 bottle lasts. But the Dive Talk Go is designed to provide oxygen at approximately your metabolic rate at rest. You're chilling, right? If you're working too hard on scuba diving, you're doing it wrong. That's why most of the dives that you do, you're relaxed. You're loving the dive.
Now, on open circuit that the deeper you go, the more volume of gas you use from your tank per breath. Mm-hmm. In fact, it depends on the number of atmospheres you're at. 99 is 4 atmospheres. It simply means on open circuit that for every breath you take at 99 feet, you're using 4 times more volume of gas per breath than you would be as compared to the surface. Now, I'm not going to lie, I get a little goosebumpy, a little excited on this particular slide.
Yeah.
This is the beauty of a rebreather. This is a comparison of the efficiency of gas use on a rebreather versus open circuit.
That's right.
No matter what your depth is, that does not affect your metabolic rate of oxygen use. So listen, the deeper you go on a rebreather, it's not going to change how much oxygen your body is metabolizing. In fact, your body doesn't even care about if the percent of oxygen it's breathing. It only cares about the partial pressure. So the deeper you go, you actually need less oxygen because you don't want to keep the same percent of oxygen or your PO2 would spike. So we've got to lower the amount of oxygen flowing in because PO2 is automatically going up just by sheer math that you're deeper. And your body only cares about the partial pressure of your oxygen. Therefore, it makes this 10.4 cubic foot cylinder unbelievably efficient. You're decreasing the amount of oxygen you need per the deeper that you go.
Yeah.
Totally mind-boggling. Like open circuit,
right.
the deeper I go, the more gas I need.
Yeah.
Not on a rebreather.
To put this simple,
It's awesome.
if you're at the surface and you take a breath of your regular open circuit tank, and let's say every time you breathe on a tank at your regular rate, you are at 26 liters per minute.
Okay.
Just breathing in open circuit. The deeper you go, the more that number goes up. So Woody mentioned 4 atmospheres earlier at 30 meters or 100 feet, 99 feet. Now, instead of 26, you're breathing 100 plus liters per minute because the gas is compressed. You're breathing 4 times the amount of gas.
Yeah.
What Woody's talking about is that our first stage is designed in a way that as you go deeper, it keeps you at the same rate. So it's not feeding you 0.7 times 4. It's feeding you 0.7.
It actually feeds you even less than 0.7 as you go deeper. It decreases the flow. The constant mass flow starts going down because of the pressure. And you have to have it do that because your partial pressure is automatically going up. So you need a less percent of oxygen in the mix the deeper you are to maintain the same partial pressure, which is what makes it's so incredibly efficient that we can use this little 10.4 liter tank of oxygen. Gosh, probably on a normal dive, that thing for me is probably going to last 3 or 4 hours, to be honest with you. We don't dive 3 or 4 hours on this, but it would last that long.
Right.
Because of this principle that we metabolize the same amount of oxygen and it's not depth dependent. It's actually work dependent. I mean, if you work harder, you're going to metabolize more.
So it feeds you enough air to like mimic that 0.7 that you had at the surface as you go deeper.
It starts to lower it, so your partial pressure stays the same. So your fraction of oxygen in the mix is going down, and you're going to have a higher fraction of inert gas, of nitrogen. So you're going to have a higher amount of other gas. Now, what's happening with that is as you're deeper, you have a higher fraction of other gas, namely nitrogen mostly, which means you're absorbing more nitrogen the deeper you go.
Which is the way scuba works in open circuit.
Which is the way scuba works. Now you're increasing your deco obligation, but because we're able to maintain a perfect partial pressure, the entire dive of 1.2, your deco obligation on the rebreather is way less than it would be if it's on open circuit, because on open circuit, you can't maintain the exact partial pressure the entire dive.
You're not mixing the perfect nitrox mix
the entire dive
in your fingertips.
That's great.
As you dive. So so this table is really good because it illustrates what you need to maintain, for example, a 1.3 PO2 at 10 feet. So 3 meters, you need 100% oxygen to maintain a 1.3.
I'm feeling a warm sense of excitement just thinking about this.
Now, if you start going down, let's say you go to 20 feet, now you only need 81% oxygen to maintain 1.3. If you go all the way down to 99, you mentioned it earlier, 30 meters, now you only need 32.5% oxygen to maintain that 1.3. So this is why this design is genius. It gives you less to maintain that PO2 no matter how deep you go.
Beauty of a rebreather.
Which is great. All right, let's wrap up this module by talking about rebreathers and decompression, which you kind of already mentioned the decompression obligation of rebreather, and that's because we're able to control that PO2 to the maximum, the best mix possible for our mission.
Doug Ebersol has always done a great job of explaining this with the teeter-totter thing that just down. He teaches it this way, and I think it's really, really good. So let's listen to this. Let's talk about this. There's give and take on everything you do in your dive planning. So if you're going to have a higher set point in your dive, you're going to I don't want to dive this dive, Gus, out of 1.2. I want to dive this entire dive out of 1.4 because guess what? I'm going to have less deco because I have a higher PO2.
Yeah.
You'll be like, yeah, Woody, but what about all the other factors? And I'll be like, oh, I didn't think about those other factors. What are those? Well, number one, my CNS clock is burning faster, isn't it? I'm at a 1.4 versus a 1.3. So I have less amount of time that I can be at 1.4 than I can be at 1.3. So that's an issue I have to be mindful of right there. Also, to maintain a 1.4, I'm using more of my oxygen cylinder. Therefore, my oxygen cylinder may not last as much. I need more oxygen in the mix to maintain a 1.4 than I do at a 1.3. So what do you want? Do you want less deco, but burning your CNS clock quicker? You got to think about that. Do you now need to carry a bigger oxygen tank because you want a higher PO2? And I know Gus is bringing up some tracking oxygen tables here. And I think it's important to understand how to use these because they talk about that single exposure limit and the 24-hour maximum exposure limit. By the way, these were all done with some perfect, probably Naval SEAL guy that tested these and didn't have any effects at these various partial pressures at various different time increments.
Absolutely. So yeah, it is important to know those limits because like you mentioned, it's a teeter-totter. The higher your PO2, the less time you can be underwater, but the less deco you will have. So it's like which one is the best? Like if you know that you're going to do a super long dive, let's say it's 4 hours plus, then the 1.2 is not going to work because we know that 2.5 hours or 3.5 hours are our limits depending on those PO2. So you may have to dive at 1.0. You may have to dive at 0.7, whatever it is. But always remember that on the surface, we're breathing 0.21, so 0.7 is still pretty good. You may just have more deco if the dive is deep. So again, being on a rebreather, having the ability to mix your PO2 to the most, the most, how do you call this?
A perfect efficiency.
Yeah,
because
the most efficient, I guess, mix.
Because an open circuit, just to summarize it, you can only be at your maximum partial pressure of that dive when you reach your maximum depth. That's it. You can't keep it constant on the way up. You can't control the amount of oxygen.
Correct.
If you're diving a 32% mix on your back, only your depth is going to control the partial pressure. You're not able to change the mixture on your back. You can't change that 32. It's going to be 32 the whole dive. On a rebreather, we just showed you, I'm changing the percent of mix inside my rebreather depending on my depth. The deeper I go, the less percent of oxygen I need because no matter what depth I'm at, I metabolize the same amount of oxygen and my body only cares about the partial pressure of oxygen, not the percent of oxygen I breathe, making this the most efficient, lovable machine in the entire world, and I love her.
And if you love her, you need to maintain her. So let's talk about maintenance.
Really important. I can't wait. That's your specialty. Can you maintain mine a little bit more?
No.